Okay, first we don't succeed, we take it a second shot here. We're going to talk a little bit about processors and film processing here. In addition, we're going to be looking at some of the more common artifacts that actually occur because of film in processing. This information is located both in your Fassbinder's book and Farber's Radiographic Imaging Exposure. Specifically, it starts on page 184 on chapter 7. Let's see, let's get this started. There. If you happen to listen to Bill Calloway in his talk on Saturday night, I believe it was, and he was talking about the boards, he made a statement that there wasn't much of anything about the film processor on the boards except for, he said, startup and shutdown procedures. He said, what else could there possibly be? Okay. That's very possibly true. You know, maybe he knows something, but this is what it actually says in the content specifications of the test. So to be honest with you, this is really what I have to kind of go by. And so we're going to cover some of these different subjects right here to one degree or to another. So we're going to talk about the question of replenishment, why water flow is important, possible causes of malfunction. I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on that. Certainly some of the components of the processor very, very briefly. But we'll see what we can do about getting through this. Okay, one of the things, the thing at the very top there, it talked about film storage. Now, we talked about this in class. A box of film is usually 100 sheets. And it's, you know, film that is sized for the specific cassette. So you got 8 by 10 film, you've got 10 by 12 film, 14 by 17. The film should be kept in an area that is, you know, relatively, I guess you say, moderate in temperature. You do not want it in an area that's too hot. So you wouldn't stick it, for example, in an air-conditioned trailer in Atlanta, Georgia. You also wouldn't basically put it in a place where you'd have a high degree of unvented chemicals that could possibly begin processing and the like. So you also want to keep the boxes of film upright, you know, much the same way as if you're stacking books in a library. The reason for that is if they basically are sitting one box on top of another box and so on and so forth, you produce pressure, and the pressure can actually cause artifacts, you know, on the film before you even get started with it. Okay, so just a reminder that the latent image that's formed following radiation exposure causes a chemical process. We talked a little bit about the Gurney-Mott theorem that produces that will, with chemical processing, produce an image. Otherwise, what you essentially have there is a latent image, so the film doesn't look any different post-exposure than it did pre-exposure. It's necessary that you process the film or expose it to wet chemicals here to actually get that visible image to actually come out. The way this happens is that we have these special machines. They run on, I guess you say, sort of a pulley-based drive that draws film, a piece of film, through a series of tanks. And each of these tanks contains individual chemicals. So you would have the first tank would have developer chemicals in it. The second tank has fixer chemicals in it. Third tank, which is used for washing, has water in it. And then finally, I guess you wouldn't call this a tank so much, but you've got an area there where you dry the film. The film is exposed to each of these for, roughly speaking, about 20 seconds, you know, give or take. So it's important that you have a feed dry system that can consistently draw the film through at the same rate. Okay, whether it's big film or little film, whether you're doing a lot of films at one time or it's very, very few, you have to have that consistency. And that's really the advantages of automatic processing. So the picture that you're seeing right here, first of all, this is done in bright light. That's not the way we used to feed film through the processor. It actually had to be done in dark rooms where we had special lights for something like that. But for the sake of just kind of the information here, they're running through what looks like almost a 30 millimeter type of film. This one's actually already been processed through the processor here, I assume, to demonstrate you know, what actually goes on here. So you have a feed tray. It should be clean, free of dust and water and chemicals and things like that, and you simply draw it in. The drive that I was referring to basically causes these transport rollers that are in there to pick up the film and pull it into the developer. Okay? All of this, as I said, is actually happening in what we call the dark room. And the dark room didn't necessarily have to be all that dark. Actually, what it had to have are special lights in there that were filtered in such a way as that the light that was emitted was not something that the film was particularly sensitive to. So if the film was blue sensitive or blue-green sensitive, you want orange or reddish orange type of light because the film really wouldn't respond to that. Now that is not to say that you could just leave a piece of film on the counter for 10 minutes and it would be okay, because it wouldn't. But you certainly could have time to get the film, carry it from the film for over here, to put it on the feed tray here, assuming we could wake our friend up here and stuff like that and feed it into the processor. The other use, as you could see here for dark rooms, was as a great place to hide. Okay, so in essence what happens is that piece of film is pulled into the developer solution, and the developer solution is there to take the emulsion layer and swell it up and kind of make it soft and things like that. And remember, there's gelatin in there, so it's not that hard to actually do that. But what you wanted to do is to swell it so that when the actually active chemicals of development can get at all parts of the emulsion, all parts of the silver halide, okay, or the exposed portions of the silver halide. Because ultimately what you're trying to do is produce metallic silver. Okay, this is actually done by special chemicals. You don't need to know the names of them. They're called reducing agents. Okay, we talked about this. Remember what essentially happens when you expose the film. The light essentially causes an ionization, and silver halide really there is, for all intents and purposes, broken apart. So the major portion of it is a positively charged ion. As such, you're trying to get it back to metallic silver. That means you have to neutralize it. And the way you do that really is by adding more electrons, which is what the developer really does. Okay, some other developer facts here. Now, correct developer temperature, I'm going to change this just a little bit because there's a range. And different books, as always, have different ways of looking at things here. But let me point something out. Okay, it's going to be from 93, which you're going to see in a lot of cases, through 95. Okay, that's the temperature range that was acceptable. Okay, the reason for that is that the developer temperature was too low, it wasn't very active. If the developer temperature was too high, it was too active. Okay, so you wanted to have it just right. And the way that essentially you got that is that there was usually a thermometer inside the developer tank. So what you would do is after you turned the developer on and things like that, and you wanted to check to make sure if it was okay to use the processor, you'd actually go in there, take a look at the thermometer that was kind of sticking out of the developer tank. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, the developer time has to be consistent too. It was generally 20-25 seconds thereabouts. And if you get right down to it, if you had too fast, then you would not have enough development. If you were too slow, then there would be too much development. And either in that case, or if the temperature was too active, what you ended up with is an overall darkening of your image because of overdevelopment. We called it chemical fog. Okay, developer works with a high pH, even at the same time that fixer actually works with a low pH, or it's acidic. And that's one of the ways that fixer can stop the activity of the developer chemicals. Okay, the other thing though with that is that if you had splashing, so that developer got splashed into the fixer, or fixer chemicals got splashed into the developer, the overall solutions could be ruined because you've neutralized their pH. Okay, usually that essentially meant that you had ruined images and you had to clean out the chemicals of out of the processor and put fresh chemicals in. Okay, in the fixer, kind of as I talked about, it stops the development. It's also going to remove the undeveloped silver halide grains. Okay, and at that point there is going to begin the hardening of the emulsion layer, because remember, up till now it's been kind of soft and mooky and stuff like that, sort of looks milky, and you want it to harden because you want it to last a long time. That process occurs there. the film is going to move into the wash where there's water that simply just cleans away the chemicals and things like that and then moves it on into the dryer. And the dryer is going to continue the shrinking of the emulsion so that you create a permanent fixed image. Okay, the transport system that I was talking about, remember that has kind of a drive system that moves everything forward. There's a bunch of pulleys and things like that. Chain drives, that's a better way. Okay, you have racks here. Now these racks are these rollers, and these are a series of rollers that move the film through the tanks. So you're going to move them down through the tank, and then you're going to draw them back up from the tanks. And remember, each of the tanks contained either your developer chemicals, your fixer chemicals, or water. Okay. Now, at the bottom of each tank were these special devices called guide shoes that ensured that the film, as it was coming down, was going to roll back up and go back up again. Okay? One thing you did not want it to do is to get stuck down here, which occasionally happened. Those are guide shoes. Remember now, shoes are at the bottom, so these guide shoes are at the bottom of the tank. Okay? As the film comes up, it's going to roll over into the next tank. It crosses over specifically into the next tank, and crossover racks were responsible for ensuring that it went from one to the other. This is where the crossover racks would be located, on the top. So guide shoes were on the bottom, crossover racks were on the top. Guide shoes were inside each of the tanks. Guide shoes sort of straddled between the tanks. And you can kind of see that, I think, better here. Okay, you came in through the darkroom and you fed your film through, and it was picked up by the transporter racks that I was referring to here, these little rollers. It was brought down, it was moved through the developer and back up again, crossed over, in this case from the developer into the fixer, rinse repeat, crosses over from the fixer into the rinse where we have water, and eventually out through the dryer, from the dryer out into the tray where the film, you could pick your film up and you could look at it and hopefully things were good. Okay? The crossover racks, remember, is this kind of a fancy device that was on the top. Guide shoes, remember, were on the bottom. Okay? So really, in essence, what you've got here is this device that basically making sure it comes from one and it's going to the other. That's your crossover. Okay, now, we also need to talk a little bit about when you're turning on a processor or turning it off. When you come in the morning, let's say, for example, and the processor's been turned off, somebody hasn't used it and things like that. First thing you actually had to do was to turn on the water. So there would be a faucet nearby, and you had to turn it on to allow for the circulation, or in some cases the recirculation of not only the water but the chemicals. Okay. At the same time, and there were problems, by the way, if you didn't do that, you also had to flip the processor on. So there'd be a switch that allows that to be on. Now, there had to be chemicals, reasonably fresh chemicals, because they oxidize, inside the processors, but there also had to be additional chemicals located in outside tanks. These were outside the processors here. And you notice we've got one here that's for developer, okay, one for fixer. You want to absolutely make sure you didn't mix them up, okay? And these things would have hoses that essentially would go on over to the processor. So the chemicals then could be recirculated or replenished as needed. Okay. Finally, you had to wait. You couldn't just automatically use the processor if you started it up cold. You had to ensure that the developer had reached a temperature. So obviously there were, what would you call it? Wires in there, heating coils in there to warm the developer up, because remember, you wanted to sit about 93 degrees, so you had to check your temperatures and all. And at that point, making sure that everything is light tight and things like that, you could use the processor. Okay. Now, if you had only occasional use. Let's say, for example, it was a Sunday night and it was really quiet. There is an automatic switch on these things. They were on a timer that we called the standby switch, and you really didn't have to do anything about this or anything. But what it did was it kept the chemical temperatures up, but it turned off the drive, so the rollers weren't rolling. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, it sounded like the processor was turned off. But what it did by keeping the temperature up is that when you turned around and flipped the switch back on to get it going again, it was relatively quick to get the temperature of the developer up again. Okay, now if you had to turn off your processor for whatever particular reason, let's say, for example, you're done for the day, there was an outpatient facility, nobody will be back, okay, you shut off the water, you turned off the processor, and you opened up the top lid. And the reason for that was to allow the gases that were inside, because remember, we're talking about chemicals here, to vent outside of the processor and into the ambient air. And, that's pretty much about it. Now, it was important to have the water turned on because, as I mentioned, you had to go to work and agitate the solutions. You had to mix it. You had to allow for stabilizing the temperatures. You had to allow the chemistry to be mixed up and things like that. You didn't want the chemicals on the top to oxidize at the same time. Nothing much was happening on the bottom. So all of these things were necessary, so you had to recirculate these chemicals and all. And the water was actually somewhat necessary for all of this. Okay? Now, replenishment meant changing out the chemicals on a limited basis. And we had two different ways of doing this. Volume replenishment meant that you circulated the chemicals. You added new chemicals in, and you had kind of older chemicals I guess you say, pumped out as each film passed through. And the amount of chemicals would be related to the size of the film. So you'd have a little bit for a little size film, you'd have a big bit for a big size film. The other way to do this was flood replenishment, and this was actually done on a timer. So like every hour or every 2 hours or something like that, you would suddenly have a certain amount of these chemicals pumped in, so then obviously you have a certain amount of these chemicals pumped out as well. And this way you kept the chemicals fresh when you were in a situation of low volume. Again, you're in a small community hospital, you're working the 11 to 7 shift, and you're not doing that many different cases. Okay, dark rooms, you saw the picture of it earlier there. Those lights that I was talking about, well, let me back up. Okay, the dark rooms were necessary to keep a low light area there so you didn't actually expose the film before you put it actually into the processor. Dark rooms needed to be clean. Okay, the counters needed to be clean. You didn't want things to trip on because you couldn't see that well in there. There should be good air circulation because, again, you had chemicals going on in there, so you wanted to be able to vent chemical gases and things like that out. There should be no light leaks of any kind around the door. In the ceiling, that used to be a good place to have light leaks, trust me. And you had to use special safe lights. They were low wattage. They were something like 12-watt lights, and they had special filters that were these GBX filters, were these kind of red-orange type of filters. And I remember what they were for is because they did not particularly, film was not particularly sensitive to that range of light. Okay. Once you process, this is sort of miscellaneous, I think. Once you've processed the film, you had these chemicals, and these chemicals now had metallic silver or silver, silver molecules in them. The EPA had regulations that said you could not dump these heavy metals like silver into the water supply. And so as a consequence, they came up with these special buckets or silver recovery type of devices, most of which were either some kind of a filter or some kind of an ionizing type of device that pulled the metallic silver or the silver halide out and collected it. And as a consequence, the remaining chemicals could now basically go down the drain, which means it could go into the water supply. But the silver was retained, and that silver, those buckets were removed on a monthly basis. So these things were because of EPA regulations. Okay, once you got that image, there's a couple of things I want to point out. You were hanging them up on view boxes, and what you saw is what you got. So uh, you had to ensure that your processing was correct so that you got a reasonably predictable result. View boxes have really, really high lumen values, and a lumen is a way that you measure brightness. And in fact, according to Quinn Carroll, the lumen value of a good view box was something like 3,000. Now, a projector, like we use in the classroom and things like that, is usually sitting at somewhere at about 400 to 800 lumens. So that should give you an idea of the difference right there. Okay, it is important that the light bulbs inside the view boxes were all working. If they burned out, then you would have kind of discrepancies in the amount of light that's given off, and that was not acceptable. So those things would have to be changed out periodically. The other thing I should point out is fluorescent lights decline over time, and so sometimes you had to change them out just because they got old and not necessarily because they were burnt out. Now, printouts, which you can do with a digital image, is essentially a fixed image too. Now obviously its source is different, but I just want to point out that as a fixed image, you're going to be looking at them on view boxes as well. So this is like a film. You should be looking at these things in a relatively low light area. And the reading rooms that you see for radiologists, for example, are a very low light area. And the reason for that was just to ensure that the ambient light, or the light in the room itself, is not bouncing off of your images and contributing to glare, which makes it difficult for you to actually look at these images. The other thing is, as I've mentioned to you before, of course, is eye strain. If you're going from very dark looking at something very dark to something very light, back again, you really, really kind of wore your eyes out, okay? And that was usually a pretty fast way to get a migraine. Okay, I mentioned that we were going to look at some of these artifacts. Now, there are artifacts that are unique to digital imaging too. We're just looking at things that are based on processing right now, or film, okay? Please understand that film was kind of fragile. So as a consequence, you didn't want to bend it, you didn't want to buckle it, you didn't want to drag it across the counter, you didn't want to splash things on it, no pressure marks or anything like that, because if you did something like that, you were most likely to have artifacts on the images. What we tried to do is to handle the film on the edges when at all possible, and the reason for that is to keep finger marks and things like that from showing up on important anatomical areas. Okay, by definition, an artifact is some kind of a structure or something, okay, that should not be on the radiograph. So it's not part of the anatomical information. Now this is a very, very broad definition, and if you get right down to it, you're talking about anything there essentially from underwires onto a bra, to change, to a belt, to most anything. Okay, now this actually comes out of one of Bouchon's. I hope you guys have had a chance to listen to him talk today. His breakdown of some of the different types of artifacts that you have. You don't have to memorize all of these. I'm actually only going to show you a certain number of them and all. Some of them, though, I think, for example, like emulsion pickoff, is probably pretty obvious and all. Okay, dichroic stains showing increased density. This could happen because, for whatever reason, you had an excessive amount of development going on. This could happen, for example, if you splashed developer chemicals onto the feeding tray, the tray that you fed the film through. It might splash from the tank, who knows. But what happens is that you got these chemicals on the film and development began too early, and as a consequence you ended up with all these dark spots. Okay, fixer could also have artifacts, and retention of fixer was a real problem back in the days, particularly of manual development, which is really what you've got here, particularly on that image over to the left. In essence, what happened was that the reason you had wash is to wash the fixer out, because the fixer eventually changes colors, and that's what you can kind of see here. This kind of funky mustard yellow color is a sign of fixer retention. Okay, all right. You could have scraping marks as well too. Now these type of scraping marks could happen, let's say for example, if you had a situation where you had trash at the bottom of a tank, and specifically if it got caught somewhere, for example, in here where the guy's shoes were. So something got up in there, and now all of a sudden you're running the film through and it's scratching it, and it's really scraping the emulsion off. So this is really, for all intents and purposes, going on, say for example, during development. It might happen in Fixer, but you reasonably you'd expect something like this during development, where you're just scraping the whole thing off. You could have scratches because of improper handling. It got scraped up against something, however, and you ended up essentially with the emulsion being picked off like that. You could also get static artifacts, and static sort of look like, electricity. It looked like lightning, and you can kind of see tree static here, and this thing's all kind of strange looking. This typically happened because of some kind of friction activity. You rub the film across the counter or the tray or something like that. Or, and I have to say this is probably as common as anything, you had low humidity. If you think about, for example, the air conditioning that was constantly going on, you, a lot of cases ended up with a state of low humidity inside these buildings because they were pretty well sealed. And as a consequence, you could develop things like this actually happening. That was a real problem. This is just another one here showing you these kind of scratches. These are pressure points here that are occurring. For example, there's trash on maybe one of those transport rollers, and it's just pushing on the film. You could also have water spots. Maybe there was water on the feed tray because, I don't know, how about if you put a cup of Coke on there and the water, it sort of condenses on the outside and got left on there. Well, the water would interfere with development, so you had less development. And you can see here, a dichroic stain meant you had overdevelopment, and so you had darkening, whereas for something like this, you had less development, so you ended up with light in areas. Okay, and of course, as we talked about, there's all sorts of artifacts that can occur. Clothing artifacts, for example. You could have maybe wires that you didn't want there. You could have bobby pins, earrings, necklaces, you name it. All of those things concern. You might have the IV pole in the way and it shows up. Any of those things are possible. This is an example of a double exposure, and it's fairly obvious. You may not always see one that is quite this obvious. In fact, if you look carefully, you notice that you've got pictures of hands and pictures of feet superimposed. This can happen with film. This can also happen with a CR cassette. You can't do this with a DR cassette because you can only make one exposure at a time there, so that essentially prohibits something like that actually occurring. Okay? All right, next one. There we go. I think that's the end of it. So that's just some of the more common artifacts that you actually found, and I hope this kind of helps you to give you just a general overview about processing. Remember that if you're doing the test in if you're doing the test in 2016, this material will be on there. You may be required to put the chemicals, like the DFWD that I was talking about, arranged in order. You may be given an example of an artifact and told to kind of identify it. They won't ask you to identify the cause, though, I don't believe. So there really isn't a whole lot much more than that. They may talk about replenishing and things like that. That's probably about it. So that should pretty well take care of it here, I think.